So namaste and welcome to Satsang today. So one of the ways that a teacher can help to shortcut the process of awakening, the realization and then being and seeing what we really are, coming to live as that constantly and effortlessly. One of the ways we can speed that up is to really point out places where we tend to get stuck in our awakening, or as was more common for me when I was really sort of struggling through illusion, was it would have been helpful if somebody pointed out places where my thinking was in a limited way that I hadn't perhaps realized. And there are things that come clearer as your awakening deepens that just literally weren't clear in the beginning of the process, or even quite far into it. So one of those areas for me was that I hadn't fully, I kind of seen that I was formless. I couldn't find, when I looked, I couldn't find a thing, an object to me that was a definable shape. And I'd come to recognize that I was formless. And it took me a long time after that to recognize what that really fully meant. And one of the things I would like to try to explain, it might not be completely clear what it means to be formless. And the aspect I really want to look at today is that the formlessness is indivisible. And the way our mind thinks about things quite often can be sustaining some of the illusion. So what do I mean is by indivisible? Well, if we say that we are formless, and we, to whatever extent that we have come to recognize that and realize that, and even if it's only theoretical right now, if you haven't yet had an experience of that, it doesn't matter for what I'm going to say, you'll still be able to get something out of it. If we look at the way our mind thinks, it thinks inherently in terms of twoness, and it thinks in terms of form and formlessness being two different things. So it thinks the formlessness that we are has then somehow created the creation of all these objects, including my body, your body, the planet, everything. That has actually occurred, that two things are of present, form and formlessness, that they are different, that they are two. And inherent in that assumption that form and formless are two different things is the idea of diminishment. And what I mean by that is somehow, because now two things are there, form and formless. So in this, I'm just talking about perhaps my mind and my body are the form, and my essential nature of the formlessness, that somehow by my mind and body coming into being, that the two, form and formless, are less than they were before. And we can be carrying this idea that somehow when form comes into being, it is less than it was before when it was formless. And if this isn't immediately clear, don't worry. This is one area where I always end up feeling a little challenged and trying to put words to something. So inherent in pretty much every human being I've ever met is this idea that there's some fundamental flaw in our nature as human beings, that we're not somehow good enough, adequate, or worthy. And I really wanted to spend some time thinking about that when I was waking up. Why has that actually occurred? And it was this idea that in the process of creation, the way the mind thinks it happens, that form actually arises out of the formlessness. Something is made out of nothing, nothingness. form arises out of the emptiness of our being, that the form has somehow lost its inherent perfection in that. And while we may not be outright thinking that, whenever we look or think or talk about our body, there'll be some sense there of it not being how we want it to be. And we can also see that in the world, it's not how we want it to be. We could project that anywhere and everywhere. So I really wanted to look at what actually happens in the process of creation, and hopefully kind of put this idea of diminishment or less than the original, put it to bed once and for all. If you really start to sort of think about what I'm saying, if you spend some time thinking about it, it'll become stunningly clear that nothing at all is lost in the creation process. So our mind thinks, it tries to imagine the infinite self. And I'm going to use my hands like this to kind of visualize this here between my hands is the infinite self, and it's obviously unlimited to what I can show you, but in words. But imagine for a second that this is the universe between my hands. The entirety of all that is here. And our mind says that when a form happens, that some part of this whole has come into form, that some part here is this body and this body and this body and this body and this planet and this star and this plant and this. So our mind can only think of oneness in terms of parts of a whole. And each part of a whole, WHOLE, is less than, by its very nature, less than the whole. So if I had a whole universe and I divided it up into forms, sliced it up somehow, each form would come into being with this idea that is less than the whole. And that is pretty much how our mind functions. It thinks of oneness in terms of the sum of all of its parts, that the self is somehow all of the forms and formlessness together. But inherent in the idea of division is diminishment, less than what we originally started with. And this idea really torments us when we're constantly feeling unworthy, not as good as the inherent perfection of the self. And this idea plays out all over our lives. So we have the wholeness of the universe, the self, all that is, was, will be, and ever could be. And our mind imagines that to create a form, we have to take a piece of the whole and another piece of the whole and another piece of the whole. But in reality, what's actually occurring is that the self puts all of itself into every single thing. So instead of this and this and this taking away from the whole, there's less of the original left. What actually occurs is the entirety of all that is condenses itself down into a something. And then it does that again, something else over here, and it does that again over here. And it's doing this as a human being, and it's doing this as a plant. The allness, the entirety of all that is showing up as your mind and your body. And it began to strike me when I saw this that nothing is lost in that process. There is no diminishment when you take the entirety of all that is and make it visible and tangible. All that has occurred in that is that the invisible, formless everythingness has become perceptible, tangible to our senses. And with this understanding, the idea of this diminishment goes, because it can do this an infinite number of times a second and is constantly making these forms, condensing itself down into different shapes. Even this isn't strictly true, but it's the closest I can get in language right now. Really, there's only one manifestation, and all of these shapes and forms are really the ripple on the ocean surface. You could say, just like the ocean isn't diminished when a wave arises. And in fact, the wave that rises on the ocean surface is the entirety of the ocean. That wave could not exist without all the other waves and all the water underneath, the fullness. So when I really began to get this, I understood more clearly what it was meant when people would say, well, you are the Buddha already, you are Krishna already, you are the self already. And the Buddha, like the Buddha statue here, for me for a long time, the Buddha statue represented some mind and body that thousands of years ago woke up to the truth and taught everyone and was the founder of this whole following, Buddha himself. But the statue actually represents all the allness of it. And even all suggests more than one, but it's the best term I can find. So we use a form, a statue, to represent the allness, that the allness is present in the form, and that they are really the same thing. It can look diffuse, invisible, everywhere at all times, or it can look like a something or a someone. And that nothing has actually been lost or changed in that process. What does this mean for you then? What does this mean for understanding your awakening, moving beyond karmic patterns? Well, if you really begin to think about this, then any idea of incompleteness, unworthiness, not yet there-ness in your awakening will begin to disappear. Right now, where your body is, it is the universe itself appearing as a human body. And there can be no less than, not good enough in that. You are very literally a divine sculpture made out of the self that is the only thing that there is. Pure awareness looking like a human body. And your body is the Buddha statue. It's a representation of all of this, the allness of it, the power inherent in that which is here before creation is still inherent in every single cell of your body. And scientists have kind of begun to figure this out, that the universe is holographic, meaning that at any point in the universe, it contains the wholeness, the power and the substance and everything. And we can even see this in science when we look at our DNA as human beings. We have the same DNA, pretty much almost identical, 99 point something percent of all the species. And if you look at a human embryo, it goes through stages where it looks like an amphibian, it looks like a fish. There's a point where it looks like an alien as well. All of this is just kind of to try to explain that what this is not really a body, that the form is the universe appearing as this particular thing. And when you really start to ponder this, it becomes quite amazing, because have you ever really thought about that every single hair on your head, the entirety of the universe has poured itself into that hair, appearing as a hair, or a skin cell, or a fingernail, or a speck of paint on the wall, or a speck of dust, or a distant star, or a galaxy. And it really begins to move beyond this label of body and form as having lost something inherent in the process of creation. Every single skin cell, blood cell, piece of bone, tissue, everything, even the skin cells that you're losing as we're talking, and who knows however many hairs we lose each day, new ones growing, the air that you're breathing in and out, it's not really what we think it is. It is the allness appearing as this thing. So why is this important? Well, if you can come to see that even the tiniest particle of dust is Krishna appearing as this, the allness, somehow pulling off this amazing trick of looking like a speck of dust, looking like a tiny, insignificant little thing. Then you can't really think about this for too long without really breaking through any sense of unworthiness. That what's looking right back at you in the mirror in the morning is the wholeness, the allness. It doesn't know, excuse me, it doesn't know how to divide itself into pieces. It never has. It looks like it does when it seems to somehow make itself into something. But the moment it makes itself into something, it hasn't lost any of its infinite power. It can create infinite number of forms and is doing every single second. And forms are dying and changing constantly. And it remains its immaculate, it retains its immaculate purity. And what I would really like to get across, if I can, is that immaculate purity is present in all of the forms. When it does this, everything that is this, everything that creates the entire cosmos, the universe, all of the distant galaxies, all of it is appearing in each individual cell, even in the subatomic particles inside an atom. And if you really think about this, you're never going to be able to look at yourself again in the same way. Never going to be able to think thoughts about yourself that are judgmental or less than, or anyone else for that matter, as it really sinks in. Whatever you look at, wherever you go, whatever you experience, whatever you eat, the air that you're breathing, whoever you talk to, literally forever is the allness right in front of you. So it will always appear that this is a universe full of infinite number of forms that are all separate to each other. But what if that's not really what's occurring? What if it's really a one moving, changing, constantly undulating? The forms are just on the surface, so to speak, of this cosmic oneness. So when we say you are the Buddha, again, this is where mind loses something in the process. Mind thinks, I am the same as the Buddha. He was this and I am the same, made of the same stuff. But even more literally than that, even more one than that, you literally are him. The same stuff that was made to used to create Siddhartha Gautama's body is made to create yours. Your eyelashes, everything. Every single eyelash and skin cell and everything and hair is the perfect divine sculpture. And you know, when I really began to understand this, something fundamentally changed for me. I could see that the way I've been thinking about creation, firstly, was this myth that we're all believing that something actually, two came out of, now there's two and there was one to start off with. And if I take the air in this room, in this air right now that I'm breathing and that you're breathing, there is water vapor in the room, in the air, that's invisible. But if we squash it down enough, put it under enough pressure, it will turn eventually into a liquid that you can see with your eyes and drink. And then if we apply even more pressure, it will eventually turn into a solid ice that you can actually pick up and hold. Has anything happened at all to the H2O molecules in that water vapor? Nothing. They're just vibrating slower. What if the whole universe is like this? The same inherent stuff, condense down to vibrate slower and become perceptible to our senses. Creation then really is only a change of vibrational frequency rather than an actual occurrence. And it's so important to grasp this the best that you can, because you begin to experience everything differently. You begin to experience everything is inherently your own self, the self. And you'll notice more and more how you begin to think about this diminishment, this sense that's in all of us that I've come across, that there's something fundamentally flawed about you. If not the formlessness, then your mind and body, or your personality, or this thing you'd like to get rid of, or this thing that you'd like to get more of. I'd like to be more like this and less like this. Well, what if you came to really see that right here, right now, already, you're never going to be any more the allness than you already are? Infinite power appearing as a human body. You get a little taste of that infinite power when we see someone who's split an atom. Obviously that has been used for purposes that are not so constructive, or rather destructive, but you can see inherently the power behind, or inside every single atom. That power is in every cell of your body. That power is creating all of your thoughts appearing as thoughts. Thoughts are not really what we think they are. And I began to recognize what creation actually was. That's an ongoing, ever-changing, ever-unfolding, real-time, three-dimensional molding and sculpting of these vibrations, which make the invisible seem visible and tangible. And that nothing has actually changed. There isn't one thing becoming another, formless becoming form, rather. That never actually occurred. That this great, undivided, indivisible self pours its allness into everything it does. Where does that leave your insecurities, your lack of confidence, your unworthiness? Can you still think about yourself or anyone else in the same way when this really hits you? And it doesn't need to be that you completely grasp everything of what I'm saying right now. It's enough if I can stimulate you to think about this, that the way that we think about creation is this diminishment, that somehow this here is less than the original template it was made out of, because it is a part of the whole. There are no parts in the indivisible self. You are the whole appearing as a part, but there could never be such a thing. There's just you everywhere. And in some places you're appearing as invisible, intangible. Some places you're appearing as tangible and visible and audible. That's the only thing that's going on. Some places your frequency changes and we call you a rock, and then some places we call you a planet, and then air, and then a human body, and then fear, and then bliss. Really, all of that is an interplay on the surface of the ocean of consciousness, the self. And if I could point you in any direction, it would be to get curious about this, really curious, to engage your mind in a powerful way, to think on purpose, to want to really know, what does it mean to be formless? What does it mean to be indivisible? What does it actually mean to be already whole and perfect? And am I still believing somehow that I've lost that on some deep level in my being? Am I still trying to be better than I am? Improvement will still occur. Your mind and body will always be reflecting this deeper, this truth, this inherent perfection. Evolution of the body and mind and manifestation continues. And it can continue unimpeded without this idea of diminishment that comes from thinking about parts. Anything else at all, we could take it and divide it into pieces. Anything that's made. But really, everything that's made is this allness. Sometimes it looks completely the opposite of the formlessness. It is still inherently that. So looking at yourself in your relationships, in your job, in your finances, in your awakening, are you holding this idea of less than, diminishment? You somehow feel deep down that you'll be better or more perfect or more complete when you've woken up. And of course we all do. I did. And that was my main motivation for wanting to wake up, to be, to flush out all the negative things I wanted to get rid of and bring all the positive things to somehow make up for being less than I needed to be. What if that's not true? I never was. How does that change your life moving forward? How does it change how you interact with the human beings if you begin to recognize just exactly what is standing in front of you, the next person you meet? Can you really hold on to your karmic patterns with such tenacity? Of course, we don't mean to, but we still do. We have a loyalty to those ways of thinking about ourselves. Can you really hold on to them so much when you really get this? That anything at all we put under a microscope, or even the giant black hole, the universe itself, is already inherently perfect. And that translates to your body. Your body is made of the universe. It's not like we divided up the universe into all these infinite forms, and that each form was some part of it. It's not like that. And the impact of that may not have fully hit you yet, just as it didn't for me. Indivisible means actually not able to be divided. Never able to be divided. Not even into the original duality, form and formless. Not even then. Still formlessness appearing to be form. And I'm stressing this because it took me a while to really get the understanding of what I'm saying here. That no matter what I look at or experience, if I'm having judgmental thoughts about another human being, those thoughts are the allness appearing as a thought. And it's hard to retain any sense of unworthiness when you really get this. Not arrogance, not even confidence, although it comes that way. Just a deep and abiding understanding that there could never be anything imperfect about any of this. Although, of course, it appears in ways that we label as good, bad, and downright ugly sometimes. And this understanding, when you really begin to grasp this, is enough to begin to change what you see around you. When you look at everything and see its inherent perfection, no matter what it's appearing as right now, it has to begin to change, has to. And with this goes terms like good and bad and wanted and not wanted. When there's only ever one thing you're experiencing or looking at, what happens to wanted and not wanted and good and bad then? Right and wrong even. There's just the manifestation in its various vibrational frequencies. The lower ones we tend to call bad, The higher ones we tend to call good and wanted. And of course, there's a whole spectrum of human behavior in that. But when we can see that they're naturally trying to rise, these frequencies are naturally trying to rise, and that they'll do that spontaneously to a higher frequency, when we see it clearly. So the self is perfectly appearing as someone feeling inadequate, or the self is completely appearing, pouring its allness into showing up as fear, or guilt, or peace, or bliss. It doesn't know how to do anything halfway, or even 99%. It doesn't have anything other than pouring 100% of itself into the shape. It can't be anything less than that ever into the form. So just something to ponder there, and remain feeling slightly challenged with trying to explain this in words, but hopefully it's given you something to think about. And you're still imagining yourself to be a part of the one, a small part of the one being, the allness. Or are you recognizing what that means? The fact that this form is here is the allness showing up as this. Okay, so I will read a couple of questions that have been sent in, and then we'll take some questions live. So the first one says, "Dear Helen, thank you so much for the time you take to answer our questions. I was wondering about the projection process. If I describe a belief that I am radiating with an arrow that is reflected back to me by other people or objects, what happens to the arrow if it hits an enlightened being? Or in other words, can the reflection take place only on objects compared to a kind of absorption and re-emission by the true self? And if so, do I have a choice either to react as the reflection or as the absorption and re-emission?" Intelligent question. With love. So if I project a belief, if I have a belief, I'm going to be experiencing that belief as my experience in the moment. So let's say I feel not good enough, or I feel that I'm not safe. I'm feeling a lot of fear in one way or another. Let's go with the fear one for now. Then I'm going to experience situations and people and events that make me feel unsafe. And that's the projection process. My fear in here is also appearing as the people, places, and situations out there, because they really are the same in here and out there. So what happens if I approach an enlightened being and I feel unsafe? I feel unsafe, and this fear that's radiating inside. Well, that cannot then show up as an experience of that. In the field of the energy, or whatever you want to call it, of an awakened being, the vibration of fear, the vibration of the belief I'm not safe, will be spontaneously absorbed is a good word that you've used here. It will be spontaneously enlightened. That belief will get enlightened momentarily in the presence of an awakened being. Meaning it's very hard to keep feeling unsafe when you're around that kind of energy. So it won't be reflected back in the things that I'm experiencing, mirrored back to me. In fact, I'll begin to have the opposite experience, that I feel very safe, loved and nurtured and all of that. And so, yes, you do have, if I'm understanding you correctly, you always have a choice And maybe not the conscious choice that we think. If I am being myself, the self, then whatever anyone is projecting onto me, I don't have to keep playing a part in their karmic patterns. Most of what we call relationships are really two karmic patterns, two levels of consciousness interacting with each other. And finally, in that awakened presence, that doesn't have to, this is coming from this way and it just diffuses here. And what's radiated back is love and peace and all of that. And I think you said it, I think you're saying the same thing here, that it can only take place on an object, and the object here being a someone or a something. But as we were saying earlier, if you know what everything is, then it's not really going to be reflected back to you in the same way. So even in realizing this, you'll stop projecting, and you'll also stop reflecting back to other beings. You'll be that diffuse, spacious presence in which everything kind of dissolves into that. I hope that helps. I'll read one more and then I'll take the two hands that are up there. Cosmic self, non-duality, infinite intelligence, enlightenment, unlimited consciousness. Are we not just creating more stories? So these are all words that I've used for the self, the allness, as I'm calling it this morning. Cosmic self, non-duality, infinite intelligence, enlightenment, unlimited consciousness. Are we not just creating more stories? Well, yes, if you leave it at the label level. Words and labels, names like enlightenment, unlimited consciousness, cosmic self, they're meant to point to something beyond the word, aren't they? They're meant to point to the direct experience. And for a while, it's nicer to have these stories, I am the unlimited consciousness, than it is to believe I am a separate person alone in the world, separate to everything else, alone in the universe even. It feels nicer to believe I am the cosmic self, I am the non-dual self, than it does to believe that you are a separate being. But if you stay at that level, the belief, and don't go to the direct experience, then yes, they are just more labels. But they're pointing to the place in which labels arise as forms, names, words. The allness, before it has appeared as anything, is what they're really pointing to. So there's a point where they're just more labels, but then you'll want to go beyond even those positive labels. Even the self-definition that I am the self, capital S, I am para Brahman, I am pure awareness, eventually will feel too small. You won't want to define yourself at all. And that's when all labels begin to disappear there. So yes and no, ultimately, answer to that question. Okay, so Sylvia, when you're ready.
Hello.
Hi.
Can you hear me well?
I can, thanks.
Thank you. Hello. Excuse me. I would appreciate if you can bring some more clarity. Is in the line what we have just discussed. When you are, how shall I put it? Let's say, what role or what is the relationship between this the personality that each of us, body and mind, possess,
yeah,
in terms of acknowledgement that you see that is just in a play. So when you look from the point of view of truth, each of, let's call them enlightened person, still possess certain personal characteristics based on which there is a flavor of behavior, put it this way. I'm not saying that there are aggression or stuff like that, but there is certainly a difference between, for example, you and enlightened person in India or in Africa or whatever.
Yeah.
Am I clear? I don't know if.
I think so, yeah. And I'll try and answer, but please tell me if I'm not getting where you need me to go. What makes us individual and unique is not the body or the mind. There is an individuality that exists on an energetic level even before it becomes a mind and body, a very subtle manifestation. That individuality expresses itself through the mind and body, and it is, and as the mind and body also. So your individual self would put on a body, take on a human body, like you would put on a garment of clothing. And depending on whichever garment of clothing you're wearing, you look different, don't you? Different colors, different shapes and styles and all of that. And just because the idea of separateness, a separate being has gone, doesn't mean that individual expression has gone. You can see that you are part of the allness without losing, you can see that there's a wave and the ocean without losing the wave. So what remains after the separation has gone is just what's always been there, the formless reality showing up also as this individual, but not separate being who is, it's going to express itself as different likes and dislikes and preferences and ways of being, moving, talking, speaking. And that is further expressed as different physical form. All of our physical forms look different, don't they?
Yeah.
So is this getting to where you...
Yes. So for example, let's say that there is, call them, and a person established in the truth. There are two, person one and person A and person B, and each of them has to interaction with another human being, and one express point of view from the truth, but will express it, for example, very vocally, could, for example, even yell or scream or be temperament, while the other one who is also expressing the point of view from the truth, but will be more diplomatic or gentle or something like that. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and the way that the truth expresses through all of us is different, and we see that in all the different beings that have expressed the truth. And some of it is coming through the cultural conditioning of that particular body and mind as well. It's changed the language, even the particular language here, it's using English. If it was born in a different country, different body in a different country, it would use a different language. There'd be different words, it stresses, different sounds. So everything would be different also depending on where in the world it is expressing itself or where in the universe. So it's the same inherent truth, but it's going to sound different and be different in every single way it appears. And not just as an awakened being, every single human being is expressing themselves differently, aren't they? There's no two the same in that way.
Because somehow there are kind of imagination that the enlightened person is always, to put sugar everywhere and it's always nice and smiling, but
it's not always like that. Yeah.
Yes, it's a kind of misinterpretation. I just want to be sure about that.
The human body still remains, and the individuality that's always been there still remains after awakening. It's just not constricted anymore by this idea that it's a separate being. And it might, any inherent personality traits will still be there in that individual. Some of the rougher edges get smoothed off and it tends to express itself in a more loving way. But, there's plenty of examples of beings that have had a very compassionate, loving teaching style. There's also examples of the opposite, go away, leave me alone, I've nothing to teach you,
Yes.
And everything in between. And that's the beauty of the allness showing up as something or someone. It never ever runs out of ways to do that. And each one is different somehow. But what was there before awakening is still there afterwards, isn't it? It's just not limited in its expression now as a human being so much.
Yeah. So I think the core of what you just said is, if you've accepted this kind of behavior, for example, somebody, let's say a big temperament, heavy vocal, accept it, and express it from the point of view of truth, which means not harm, but not harm like from the point of truth, yeah. But also instead of try to repress it in you, because that is resistance, right?
Yeah. It tends to, it looks like after awakening, a human being goes through a transformation where they become much more loving, compassionate, and all of that wise. But really, that was always the natural state, but it was so impeded by this belief in separation. It's hard to express the allness when you think you're just something, a tiny dot in the universe, isn't it? So when that begins to flow, and how that flows, that love and compassion can be very direct sometimes, and sometimes very soft and compassionate, and everything in between. And they're not necessarily two different things, are they?
It's often perceived by others, this kind of acting, as a symbol of egoism, and it's difficult, of course, to deny or to that's their point of view. But yeah.
Love will be direct as it needs to be. Sometimes it will say, there's no separate being, you're making all of this up. And then sometimes it will say, how do you feel about that? Let's see what we can do about this emotion. And then sometimes it'll say nothing and just sit quietly with you. And it's equally direct whichever way it goes, isn't it, in that? And then you add on to that the cultural ways of doing things, depending on where that expression of truth is actually appearing in the world. And it leads to this melting pot of expressions of the way teachers teach, basically. Enlightened beings orient themselves.
But those tendencies, or the characteristic, not tendencies, characteristic that each person has, they will be, as you said, slightly like deemed down, right?
Yeah, and if you take any famous teacher and looked at them before they woke up, you would see the same characteristics and traits there before, but they might have just been expressing themselves in a less refined way or something, Like I had this, all my life I remember this ability to be very direct, and sometimes that got me in a lot of trouble, in the wrong situations. And awakenings finally show me where that is best used for. So what was something that I thought was negative, to say something like it really is and not sugarcoat it, or to say what needs to be said rather than what someone wants to hear. That's not a trait that's very valued in the world, but it's actually very valuable here doing this. So you would have seen the same thing, but it would have looked different maybe when I thought I was a separate being.
Okay.
Lovely.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Good conversation. Thank you. Okay, Vidya.
Yeah. Hi, Helen.
Hi.
This is really, really, really exciting. I just love the what you were saying at the beginning, and the two questions that come in as well as Sylvia's. It just remembered, say, going back, you're talking about the energy, and often the space in the room, if I really tune into that, it's just like lots of what looks like particles. And then you've got the appearance of the more solid objects, which appear solid. But if I tune in long enough, they too can appear like little particles. But
it gets really trippy, huh?
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, if I go back, say, just over 20 years ago, and I also got an insight into that too with the, I was sort of seeing, well, there was no time, we could say 20 something years, but because as that infinite self, then whatever appeared 20 years ago really isn't 20 years. It's just appeared. I've never gone anywhere, and I could never have moved. So it's just appeared. But I remember sitting in an ashram in a meditation hall, and just coming out of the meditation, this ceramic statue, Satya Baba, just came alive. It was even pinkish when it was a white statue, appearing solid. And it just moved. And I never even questioned it. It was just like, because I just felt in a meditative space, but then that appeared separate at that time. But there was aliveness about everything. And walking across the bridge at Rishikesh, there was the mountain. It just moved. It was absolutely beautiful. I remember just staring at it, but everything was just accepted as magical there. There was no investigation for me any further. And then one time I was at a church, not far from us, and I was meditating Christ on the cross come alive. And then when I went to leave, the Mother Mary statue, I remember just looking at her, and she was pinkish, and I remember touching her, and the energy, it wasn't a solid object. I remember touching her, but not thinking, oh, I should be feeling something, but I was just feeling like my beingness. Yes. So it just all, with what you were saying, that aliveness, I've never really investigated. And just to quickly fast forward, a few weeks ago when we were at this universal peace camp, they had about 3 hours of the Sufi, they do the twirling, and it was just movement and that. And later, because I know I felt very energized there, and I went outside, and I hadn't seen that before, but the trees, they were quite big trees, so normally as a solid object they can't move because they're so solid, but they were just dancing.
Yeah.
And I looked at them, and you're dancing. And then I thought, no. So I looked at the other one that was just as big, and it was moving as well. So with what you were saying about everything being energy and what I am, then they are me.
Yeah.
They have to be the same.
Yeah. And to some extent, they transcend the inherent limitation of the label tree. When you know it's not a tree, some things are possible to experience that just aren't when we're labeling it as tree or human being. It's a very different experience, isn't it? Let's just say.
Yeah. So thank you for that, because now I can really investigate, what is this really? What am I really? And I think you've used before about the like the clay. You can take this one lot of clay and make it into different shapes, but it still doesn't. It's still all clay, and it hasn't diminished at all.
Hasn't lost any of its clayness, even when it looks like a cup or a plate or whatever you've made it into.
Yeah. So so really that's just for me to investigate even deeper, and what am I, and but thank you so much, because just looking at things very differently, and without the thinking about it and the labels. And
3 hours of Sufi whirling, I bet that was an experience and a half.
Well, I didn't do the whirling all the time. It just moved however the body wanted to to move. So
No
there's a lot-
sleep for 3 days after that, yeah. High as a kite.
yeah. Well, I don't think it was either slept all night or didn't sleep at all over that full pick. So it was just, beautiful connectedness and love, and helping some little beliefs, conditioning fell away, in that love. So
Lovely. Oh, thank
Yeah.
you for sharing.
yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Love you heaps. Thank you for
Love you
everything.
too.
Share.
Thank you. Okay, so that seems like a good place to leave it for today. Thank you for your presence, your contribution. Namaste.